The following recording is a program of the World War I Historical Association. This special ongoing series commemorates the centennial of the First World War.
This is Dana Lombardi. On September 20th, 2014, the Florida and Gulf Coast chapter of the World War I Historical Association held a seminar with the co-sponsorship of the Public Library of Foley, Alabama. 6 noted scholars gave presentations under the theme 1914, Europe Goes to War. These presentations are presented here in 6 videos recorded at the event.
Needless to say, it's very good to be here. I've met some of you previously, and of course I used to be a student of Andy Weiss. When was that? When did we decide that was? 1999. Yeah, 1999, 2000, when I was in my graduate program, my second life. But one of the things I want to talk about today is basically the mobilization, how it came to pass, and I'm sure that a lot of you already have a lot of knowledge in that regard about the mobilization and all of the events leading up to it. But I'm hoping that I can add a few things of interest. In any case, 1914, needless to say, was a different world than it was in 1918, and it most certainly was a different world than the world we know today. There had been no wars between any of the great powers in almost 45 years. People could travel without passports. It was an era, we hear a lot about globalization. Well, the Wilhelmine era, or the Victorian era, was an era of true globalization. No customs controls, basically free flow of capital, and what has often been termed a golden age of security. Well, the golden age of security turned out to be more of a chimera, a facade, than anything else. Nevertheless, the Franco-German politics were better than they had been for many years, despite the debacle of 1870-71 that France had experienced. The leaders of those countries had made honest attempts at patching things up between them and making things better, and that seemed to be working, at least for a while. And Europe commanded the technology of the world at the time, exceeded all civilizations on Earth, basically. And of course, Britain had the largest and the wealthiest empire. In 1897, it ruled 1/4 of the landmass of the Earth, which held 1/4 of the world's population. Ruled 300 million people with only 70,000 troops in India. Something that Adolf Hitler greatly admired, come to say. As a matter of fact, in later years in a different war, or leading up to a different war, he would often speak very admirably about the power of Great Britain, and liked to consider Germany, as the Kaiser before him, a potential ally of Germany. As a matter of fact, Kaiser Wilhelm II remarked on more than one occasion, well, we should let Britain rule the seas, and we in tandem will rule the earth, or the land. And of course, it was also an age of new ideas, survival of the fittest, for one thing. The Darwinian philosophy, albeit extremely contested, hotly contested. It was a philosophy that among some very important circles prevailed, and of course that was reflected in the military technology as well. Russia, massive, but relatively primitive in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of communications, travel. Britain had the largest and the best navy. Germany arguably had the best army. And of course, the Congress of Vienna, some 100 years previously, not quite 100 years previously, had made Prussia an emerging power in Europe, although it was still considered that the Earth more or less was ruled by the so-called great powers of Europe. France, Austria, Russia, Great Britain. Germany not really included in that because Germany, like the United States, had been behind the power curve in terms of establishing a colonial empire. And colonial empires is what drove the wealth of the world, so to speak. Like the United States, they had been busy consolidating their own power within Europe following 1871. The United States, in the meantime, was still colonizing North America. When the Franco-Prussian War was being fought, we were still rounding up Indians. As a matter of fact, the Battle of the Little Bighorn wouldn't be fought until 1876. And of course, that wasn't even the end of our colonization process here in North America, while the European powers were on a massive land grab. Asia, the South Pacific, Africa, all being gobbled up as quickly as possible. And then, of course, in Germany along came Otto von Bismarck, who would most certainly change things for Germany. And Bismarck himself, a very, very, how do I term it, imposing figure. He had fought 25 duels in his lifetime. Although he did not have a passion for uniforms, as is usually assumed. Here you have Otto von Bismarck standing before the Kaiser. Here you have the newly crowned Kaiser with his son Friedrich Wilhelm. There in the Palace of Versailles when Germany was proclaimed an empire. A lot of people wonder, well, why the Palace of Versailles? Was that simply to insult the French? More than anything else, there were a lot of those German states that did not want to be part of this new empire. After all, the Bavarians and the Prussians had never gotten along, and they still don't, in many regards. But the Palace of Versailles was neutral ground. Therefore, it certainly wouldn't work in Berlin. It would not work in Weimar or Dresden or Munich. So Versailles, after all, they had Paris under siege. The might of combined German arms appeared to be unparalleled, and what better place to announce and proclaim the new German Empire, the Second Reich. Unfortunately for the world, however, Bismarck's rule would not last as long as he hoped it would, and the world later would wish it had. Bismarck himself was skeptical about colonialism. He encouraged others to engage in foreign adventures, and he was more concentrated on the balance of power in Europe. With regard, however, to Austria, one of the things that he was adamant about was not incorporating Austria into this German nation. For one thing, Austria was Catholic, Prussia was Protestant, and they had continually fought wars. Well, you had the Wars of Reformation, you had the 30 Years' War, you had strife continuing up into the 1800s over religious issues, and so Austria could not be part of it. But the main reason was the ethnicities. It was not a time of celebrating diversity. Of course, he was well aware that all of these diverse factions in Austria were not a strength, they were a weakness. As a matter of fact, his famous quote in speaking about the Balkans is, the Balkans and these different ethnic groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the whole area, the whole region is not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. Pomerania, of course, having been that Prussian province that had provided generations of soldiers for the Prussian army. Unfortunately, his mindset later would not prevail. In March of 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died. He was the first Kaiser of the new German Empire. Friedrich Wilhelm, his son, became his successor, known as the 99-day Kaiser. Friedrich Wilhelm, he would have been a different type of ruler. And unfortunately for Germany and the rest of the world, he only ruled for 99 days. Because shortly after ascending the throne, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was very liberal. His wife was the daughter of Queen Victoria. They got along very, very well with the British. They were over in England a lot, and of course visiting all of their English relatives, and there was a general mixture of feelings and opinions there, but unfortunately that was not to last. Because after ruling 99 days, dying of throat cancer, his son, Kaiser Wilhelm II, ascended the throne. He was 29 years old and became Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Germany. He would not have the same fortitude, temperament, or knowledge of political events as his forebears, as most certainly as Bismarck, and certainly would not have the tolerance exhibited by his father. As a matter of fact, he referred to his father and his mother, his family life there, as the English colony. But to his credit, this was also in turn inflicted upon him by some of his English relatives. If any of you have ever had to serve in the military with any English, you know they can really be grating at times. And of course, he found himself oftentimes snubbed by his cousins and uncles there in Great Britain. As a matter of fact, one of the issues that bothered him more than anything else, he was never accepted as a member of the Cowes Yacht Club. For those of you that are familiar with yacht clubs in Europe, well, at the turn of the century, I think that they've lost a lot of importance over the years, but they were the centers of social activity. And the Cowes Yacht Club, probably one of the most exclusive clubs in the world, because one vote could blackball you from becoming a member of the Cowes Yacht Club. And someone there just did not want Kaiser Wilhelm. And here was the Emperor of Germany unable to join, and he loved yachting. But in any case, this dislike that he often exhibited for his English relatives was not all self-inflicted. It also flowed from the other side of the channel. Well, one of the main issues at the time facing Germany, of course, was the danger of the two-front war. Once Kaiser Wilhelm II assumed the throne in Germany, Needless to say, he clashed immediately with Bismarck, and within about 10 years sent him into retirement, and failed to renew the treaties that with Russia that Bismarck had continually nurtured, continually juggled in order to avoid, under all circumstances, a two-front war. And it was that two-front war that continued to plague Germany even years later with the ascension of the Third Reich. That would also be Hitler's nemesis. Now, in order to ensure national security, everybody at the turn of the century embarked on mobilization plans. Every now and then, there will be an outrage expressed that somewhere someone has discovered in the bowels of the Pentagon or somewhere else that we actually have plans for invading Great Britain, or we have plans for invading Canada. They don't seem to understand. You have contingency plans. The world is geographically divided, and there are certain offices that are responsible so that if something happens, you can pull those plans out of a drawer somewhere, dust them off, and then have a starting point from which you can begin to plan military operations. It's not that we're getting ready to invade Canada or Great Britain. Well, the world has changed very little in the interim. At the turn of the century, everybody had contingency plans. They basically depended on their alliances and their own strengths for protection, and the ability to rapidly mobilize was paramount. Once the mobilization did begin in 1914, some of them would show great skill in rapidly mobilizing and others not. And particularly after the Franco-Prussian War, huge armies were based on universal military service. It basically became standard. Everybody had a plan, more or less, in which they would be able to, in time of war, raise a great army from their population. Germany and France, it was fairly standard, especially in Germany. All males were subject to military service for 2 years, and as the term states, universal military service. Of course, they could not draft everybody into the military because they simply couldn't afford a military that contained so many people, relatively speaking, so many people from the population. But a very large percentage of the men would be called up for the military. 2 years military service standard. 3 years for the Navy or the cavalry, because you had to have additional training, and also it was more desirable in many circles to serve in the Navy or the cavalry. And in Germany, every year they would have what they call the Kaiser maneuvers, the Kaiser maneuver. In which they would recall their reserves. They had a system of reserves in which they had many layers of reservists, and the last one of which was the Landwehr. The Landwehr was more or less a home guard, and they were people that were usually considered 35 years or older, and usually relegated to deep reserves that in time of war would continue to conduct those duties there at home that the more younger active troops would have to vacate when they were sent to the front. Now, the Kaiser maneuvers. They simulated a call-up. There was a lot of war games. A lot of beer would be drunk. The Kaiser himself always took part in them. I've read a lot of memoirs from people in all walks of life that will refer to the Kaiser maneuvers when they were soldiers. And essentially it was a big party, more or less. But they would simulate all of the call-up and everything. And these war plans were extremely detailed, particularly in Germany. Nevertheless, and I might add, the Kaiser would also have to take place. And he always ended it every year with a massive cavalry charge. The officers would grumble. They would want this guy out of the way, anything to get all of this stuff over with, because he would don the uniform of a garde du corps officer or a garde cuirassier, and then lead his regiments in this massive cavalry charge that all of the active duty officers knew was something completely obsolete and nothing but show. Nevertheless, the German army discouraged expansion during this period of time because they believed that expanding beyond the program that they had would lead to a degradation in quality. Now, as this mobilization was practiced, the reserves would be called up. There would be communications, of course, as we know it today, being non-existent. Nobody had telephones. And the entire system in Germany was built from what was termed a Wehrkreis, a defense district. And a defense district would also have a matrix within it that would enable from top to bottom communications to be issued, and within a matter of hours, every general all the way down through to the lowest private to be recalled would have received notice. Every village, every farm listed on this mobilization matrix. And it involved every aspect of life. When we think about a mobilization in this country, it's difficult for us to imagine life as we know it coming to a standstill. But particularly in France and Germany, this mobilization called up, it would essentially bring everything to a halt. All of the communication systems, basically, dedicated to the military. All of the roads, all of the bridges, all of the trains, everything had its place within this mobilization. I was 2 or 3 summers ago, I was reading through some of the German files about mobilization techniques in the rural areas. And it was interesting to read that even all of the horses within this Wehrkreis, every farmer that had a horse, that horse was entered into the mobilization plan. And for the horses, for example, every horse had a name. It may not be the same name that the farmer referred to it as, but based on the first letter of that horse's name listed on the mobilization chart, they could tell how old it was, what year it was foaled in, and what year it was born in. Because it wouldn't do them any good to have a list of horses on that mobilization chart for that mobilization NCO to go out to that farm and collect. If a farmer maybe had 3 horses, he was going to collect 1, possibly 2 of them. And the farmer, of course, is going to keep his best ones. And a 25-year-old horse probably wouldn't last 2 or 3 hours pulling one of those artillery batteries and caissons. So they always had the best, and they always took rolls and kept account of even the horses. And that's not to say, not even taking into consideration all of the equipment and everything else that had to go along with them. So if a horse's first name, and this is purely for example, started with Alicia, they would know, for example, that horse had been foaled in 1906. If it was Berta, 1907. Candice, it was foaled in 1908, and so on down the line. So that on that muster sheet, when they're determining to what units and where these horses would be destined, they could determine how old that horse was, what physical condition it was, because it had possibly been only, because they would do this every year, those inspectors would go out and keep track of all of the horses, all of the equipment. They would go in to the arsenals, make sure all of the uniforms, all of the rifles, all of the boots, everything was as it should be. One of the most telling features of a mobilization, of course, would be the closing of the transportation systems. Because you only had a certain number of trains, you only had a certain number of barges that could be freed up without shutting down the transportation system. Well, in wartime, once these armies began moving, they were going to have to use everything that was available. And it was all entered into these mobilization charts as well. For example, if a freight company had 12 barges on the Rhine River, the majority of those barges would also be entered in these mobilization charts. Therefore, they were no longer hauling coal or grain or potatoes or whatever the case may be from the Ruhr area down toward Mannheim, because those barges were being used to transport war material in the other direction. And when I say the other direction, there was a reason for that too. The entirety of the German plan was based on, of course, the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, a lot of people, when you read about the Schlieffen Plan, a lot of people assume, well, there was this guy, Alfred von Schlieffen, and he drew up this plan that really didn't turn out the way it was supposed to turn out. In essence, the Germans had no other choice other than to pull this plan out of a drawer, and that's essentially what they went with. Well, nothing is ever as simple as it seems at face value. Schlieffen, General Staff Officer from or Chief of the German General Staff, 1896 to 1907, he, based on experiences from the Franco-Prussian War, believed that a defense would not work. They simply could not sit behind their borders in case of a two-front war and attempt to defend their territory. They did not have the strength to do so. As a result, he drafted 49 different strategic plans for Germany. 16 of those plans were drafted in case there was a war only against France. 14 of the plans in case there was a war only against Russia. And then, of course, Belgium, the others were still following up. And therefore, there was no latitude whatsoever for stopping the whole thing. In 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm did attempt to convince his general staff to call the whole thing off, to put a stop to this, and Moltke, the chief of staff, refused to do so. He said, "We cannot stop, because in order to stop, you would have the entire mobilization thrown completely off base, and the entire German armies, all of these German armies that were moving, would start collapsing upon one another like the closing of an accordion, and the whole plan would go out the window." You hear a lot about the mobilization today, and people asking why, in essence, couldn't they just stop it? Well, and it is, and that's an excellent question. For one thing, why couldn't Kaiser Wilhelm have picked up the phone and called cousin Nicky in Russia and just say, "Let's put a stop to this insanity, let's not do this"? Or called his uncle in Great Britain and said, "Don't send the BEF. If you promise not to send the BEF, we will stop our offensive as well. We will bring our mobilization to a halt, providing the French decide to do the same thing." But with the communications and the distrust being as deep as it was at this time, no one was willing to take that chance. Because to stop your mobilization, to bring all of these armies to a halt on the German border, or possibly even within Belgium, because the British did extend a message to Germany demanding that they stop the invasion and withdraw from Belgian soil, which of course the Germans ignored. In order to do that, you would be placing the fate of your country directly into the hands of your adversaries. Okay, the French say, "If you stop, we'll stop." Well, are you really going to trust them to do that? Or on the Eastern Front, if Tsar Nicholas was to say, "Withdraw from Serbia and we will stop our invasion of East Prussia," does anybody really, would anybody place the fate of their country in a promise from someone who appeared at the outset to be winning the war? And again, nobody had any idea how long at this point this conflict was going to last. Now, we know on the 28th of June what had happened in Sarajevo, in essence. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand, he was a strange kind of guy anyway. He was somewhat bloodthirsty. He loved to hunt. He killed hundreds and hundreds of stags and anything else he could shoot at. But by the same token, he was also a very pragmatic person. He realized that for the empire to prevail, they were going to have to give more of these people more autonomy. His uncle Franz Joseph, anyway, his uncle simply was unwilling to oversee what he perceived of as the breakup of the Austrian Empire. And as a result, the two of them were not getting along either. And with his assassination, of course, that placed Austria in even more peril. For one thing, there was a lot of dissent in Austria amongst all of the different ethnic groups. I think I had a put a map up there of the ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians. Which is also one of the reasons that Adolf Hitler, who of course was living in Vienna at this time, well, prior to moving to Munich in 1914, had nothing but disdain for Austria and the Austrian army. It's been said that there were 17 different languages spoken in the Austro-Hungarian army. As I stated before, diversity would not prove to be a strength for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian army, because as the war was to drag on, it would begin to crumble at the seams, and then the crumbling would become absolute fissures that basically drove the Austro-Hungarian Empire to ruin eventually. Now, the outbreak of war in 1914 was not fully anticipated by everybody. As a matter of fact, when the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, it was hardly even noticed in France. In France, they were embroiled in a big scandal regarding politicians, the wife of one of whom had murdered another in his office over different rumors that had been circulating. And the French were basically overlooking this. The British had a lot of other things on their hands with regard to their colonies. Nevertheless, it was on the 4th of July, 1914, that Austria sent a message asking for Germany's support if Russia were to intervene. The problem that the Russians had with their mobilization as well, however, was the lack of transportation. Even though the French, for years, had been funding Russian railway enterprises for that purpose, but most of the Russian railways ran north and south, and that left a massive void on this front between Russia and Germany, which basically gave them the choice to invade East Prussia up near the Baltic, or direct most of their efforts toward the south against Austro-Hungary. And once the British had indicated that they were going to place efforts down in the Adriatic, then the Russians began placing more of their efforts up against the German armies in the north. Now, the Germans, on the other hand, would find this problematic as well, because they could not invade Russia very well because of the lack of transportation systems. Nevertheless, on the 23rd of July, Austria issued Serbia that ultimatum, basically giving Serbia a choice to extinguish this movement, the Black Hand movement, that had more or less been not directly but indirectly behind the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and to allow the Austrian officials to go into Serbia and administer the investigation and basically take control of the program for shutting down this nationalistic movement within Serbia. They gave Serbia 48 hours to respond. The Serbian ministers worked on a reply and decided, rather than jumping to a reply immediately, one of the things they would have to do in the face of all this was mobilize their army. And once they mobilized their army, then the balloon was going up. On the 28th of July, Austria declared war against Serbia. Russia began the partial mobilization. Now, Germany demanded a halt to the Russian mobilization. And the Russians refused. They did not realize at that point that mobilization meant war for Germany. Because once the Germans mobilized, there was no way to turn it off because of those issues that I previously mentioned. Everything in the country was dedicated to this mobilization. And you couldn't stop it halfway because of the armies piling up on the Western Front, and it would basically be placing the future or the fortune of Germany in the hands of the French, the Russians, or both, as the Germans saw it anyway. And of course, Germany has often been greatly criticized for the fact that they essentially had no other plan to defend Germany other than an invasion of neutral Belgium, which of course is true, because the Schlieffen Plan called for the invasion of Belgium, which would automatically bring Great Britain into the war as well. And the first week of August of 1914, we saw general mobilization. The 3rd of August, France and Germany declared war on one another, and the wheels were rolling with no way to stop them. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you.
Let me ask a question. Now, you obviously gone through the Schlieffen Plan and the mobilization. In the French plans, there are about 30 stages of mobilization. You know, step 1 is this, step 2 is this. And many historians, when they write about World War I, say general mobilization as if it's one single leap into mobilization. And in fact, it's many, many different steps up to that point. How did the Germans take that reality into their assessment of their capabilities and what they could do?
One of the differences between the French and the German perspective on mobilization is the French mobilized their troops much more slowly. They did not believe that they could automatically bring all of these troops up and within a matter of hours have them outfitted and then directly from there integrated into the war plans. Whereas, and that is one of the reasons that they had so many different steps that the Germans had bypassed. The Germans took the reservists and immediately called them up and activated them within their order of battle. The French did not believe the Germans would be able to do this, and that was the fundamental difference. And the Germans were aware of that as well. Nevertheless, they were aware of the differences. Nevertheless, because of the way the Schlieffen Plan was set up and established, they had to take advantage of the fact that the French would not mobilize their reserves in the same manner and as quickly as the Germans did, because it was all based on these timetables. But yeah, there was a fundamental difference. Both of them were, or the Germans were aware that the French system was different. The French were also aware, they knew about the Schlieffen Plan basically, but whether or not the Germans would actually adhere to that was open to question. But the French did not believe that the Germans would be able to mobilize as quickly as they did. They underestimated the amount of time it took the Germans to mobilize their reserves. The Germans made the same mistake with the Russians. The Germans did not believe the Russians would mobilize as quickly as they did, and they suffered the consequences, of course, up in East Prussia. And also with the fact that von Prittwitz, the German general responsible for the defense of East Prussia, he basically panicked in the face of these two Russian armies that came bearing down on it. But yeah, there were fundamental differences that within all of the antagonists, and in one form or another, they underestimated the ability to mobilize as quickly as they could. Yes, sir.
It's often been said that Germany should be blamed for the outbreak of the First World War. I'm not saying I subscribe to this, because they knew that their mobilization started a world war. Or they knew that it would involve Britain, that it would involve France, and of course Russia and Austria-Hungary. Nobody else was in that position.
That's exactly right. And that is the position that, of course, that's a position that the British expounded upon both during and following the war, as did the French. The Germans were the only one for whom mobilization was not preparation for war, it was war. The rest of them could mobilize and still contain their forces within their own borders. But Germany could not, based on this plan that they had nurtured and played with for all of these years. As a matter of fact, according to legend, when Schlieffen was on his deathbed, I think it was 1912, when he was some of the last words he uttered on his deathbed was, "Keep the right wing strong," meaning, of course, the right wing of the German army as it sweeps through Belgium and along the French coast. He wanted, above all other things, he wanted to avoid happening what actually did happen, and that was being outflanked here along the Channel by the British. That was he was absolutely obsessed with the idea that the right wing would be outflanked. And of course, that's exactly what happened.
Well, did they use this again in 39? Same
No, they didn't.
thing almost?
No, they didn't, although they had it on the table. In 1939, in 1940, of course, in 39, they defeated Poland in 5 weeks. And they had this on the planning table, and basically it was somewhat modified form. And a relatively unknown general by the name of von Manstein, he came up with another idea, particularly after a German officer in a Fiesler Storch, a little light plane, accidentally strayed over the Belgian border and crashed there, and they got the German plans. This was in 1940, I think it was February of 1940 or so. And but the problem with having those plans, do you really know if they're going to use these things? Or is this actually a plant? Did you really maybe they're a German officer willing to go into captivity to make the Belgians think that this is what we're going to do. Or maybe they are going to do this. Even though you have it in hand, how much value is it actually? Well, particularly after that incident, Manstein started working on another plan in which he wanted to give the appearance that they're doing the Schlieffen Plan, conducting that all over again, but then hold an army in reserve down here and strike through the Ardennes. The Ardennes, if any of you have not been there, it's kind of like Appalachia in many ways, the foothills of Appalachia. You've got, it's extremely hilly, dense forest, winding roads. It's very picturesque in there. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of vacation spots and everything, ski places for the winter and everything there. It's a very beautiful area. But the German General Staff wanted to avoid using that, Manstein's plan. They said, this is ridiculous. We can't push an entire army along those crooked little roads. There's too many things that can go wrong. Well, Manstein continued to make an issue of this. And eventually he was such a nuisance that they sent him to Prussia, to East Prussia. It gave him another job out there to get rid of him. Well, in the interim, there was a conference being held in Berlin, and a couple of Manstein's staff officers had to go down there for the conference. Hitler was at the conference, and during a break, Everybody's getting up and getting coffee. A couple of these staff officers, I believe they were colonels, were talking about Manstein's plan, and Hitler happens to walk in. And he overhears what they're saying, and he says, what are you talking about? One of them picks up the thing and says, yeah, this is something that Manstein wants to do. He wants to lure all the Allies up here and then cut through the Ardennes and everything, but it's not getting any traction anywhere. And Hitler looks at it. That's what we're going to do. And because he was a gambler, it was all or nothing. And the other staff officers, general staff officers, filtering back in, basically Hitler says, this is what we're going to do. I want everybody to start working on this. And sent Manstein back to the West to start preparing to implement that plan. And that's what they did. Essentially lured the British and the French into thinking that they're doing another rehash of the Schlieffen Plan, and then they struck out and headed for the English Channel and cut them all off up there. And that's very, very simplistic. Of course, it was more complicated than that, but superficially, that is how they carried it on.
Time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if I'm getting my history right, but you're talking about this place where Hitler found out all of this. This wasn't at the beer hall place where he caused the riot afterwards, was it?
Oh, no, that was in 1923.
Okay.
Yeah, that was in 1923. That was before he ever came to power.
I'm sorry, I bet.
Yeah. No, this was in the winter of 1940, and then that following May, they implemented Manstein's plan. So yeah, they were initially, they had several different plans, but it wasn't until Hitler found out about this extremely risky plan that Manstein had come up with it. He said, that's what we're going to do. Okay, thank you.